1, 2, 3.
The following is a Laura Flanders Show audio exclusive.
I grew up in a working-class family. I went to work in a shipyard at the age of 18, worked there for 3 years. Then I enlisted in the Air Force, became a bombardier in World War II. And after the war, I went to college under the GI Bill of Rights. My first teaching job was at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, a college for black women. And I became involved in the struggle in the South against racial segregation. I had been teaching for years, and my students kept asking me if I knew of a book that offered a different view, a radical view, a critical view of American history. I was looking for such a history myself and couldn't find it, so I thought, well, I'll write it.
That was Howard Zinn, born in 1922, died in 2010. His 1980 book, A People's History of the United States, has sold millions of copies. Zinn told history from the bottom up, putting people first, and laid out a version of the story in which people's movements, as much or even more than kings and presidents, mattered. While A People's History itself came out over 40 years ago, it's still changing the way history is not only told and understood, but also quite possibly made. Today, we take a look at the work and influence of historian and activist Howard Zinn. Our guests have all been influenced and touched by his work. Anthony Arnove, who worked with Zinn throughout the latter part of his life and wrote the introduction to the new 35th anniversary edition, co-edited with Zinn Voices of A People's History of the United States, a sort of source book of speeches, articles, essays, poetry, and song lyrics by the people whose stories are told in the people's history. Jamaican poet, performer, writer, actress Staceyann Chin has had a chance to perform some of those speeches live on stage in performance and in The People Speak, a 2010 documentary based on the work and co-directed by Zinn with Anthony Arnove. The clip we just played came from that documentary. Imani Perry, professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, just won the National Book Award for Nonfiction for her own bottom-up history called South to America, a journey below the Mason-Dixon to understand the soul of a nation, about which we interviewed her earlier this year. All three of you, thank you so much for gathering for this centennial celebration of Howard Zinn's birth and a look at how his work continues to influence not just the field of history, but I think our lives. I'm going to start by asking each of you, if there is somebody out there who has yet to pick up A People's History, even to skim through it, or might be unfamiliar with the name Howard Zinn, what would be your short, sharp, to the point pitch to them? Let's start with you, Imani Perry.
Thank you, Laura. I mean, I think the clearest way to say why people should read it is that it actually offers an opportunity to learn history that is not romanticized, that is not mythologized, but is actually a real history that considers both the experiences of those who are oppressed and marginalized, and also the struggles and triumphs of those people. I think when we study history, we are actually being, we learn to become stewards of our own time. And so if we study it with integrity and we think about history in terms of expanding who is considered to matter, we become better, human beings, better global citizens. And Zinn modeled that in people's history. Quite beautiful.
What about you, Staceyann, your pitch? Why should somebody read Howard Zinn?
By now, 2022, everyone knows that the history of America, history of the United States, recorded in any literary canon, in any measure of beauty or value. We know that the history of the United States that is recorded there is at best incomplete, at worst a compilation of lies. And if you are interested in truth, if you're interested in justice, if you're interested in a complete understanding of history of the United States, if you're interested in the voices that have been left out, if you're interested in the interesting voices that were not allowed to speak aloud in the times that they lived, if you want to be a part of uncovering the real history of America, pick up Howard Zinn's Voices of
People's history of the United States. And why not voices as well? Absolutely. Anthony, coming to you, your pitch. I'm already pretty sold.
Yeah, I'm sold too. And I can't say it nearly as eloquently as Imani or Staceyann, but just speaking personally, I'll say that when I was growing up and going to public school, history was my least favorite subject. And I just really felt there was no point of entry, partly because it was that distorted top-down history of presidents and generals and military conquest. And it felt so distorted to me, but also felt like there was no entry point to that history. And Howard's book was the first book that awoke me to the drama of history, to the role of ordinary people in history. And once you start understanding history from that standpoint and exploring those voices that Staceyann mentioned that had been left out of so much of our mainstream culture and so many of our official histories and textbooks, or have been presented in one-dimensional caricatures. Once you start understanding the fullness of the struggles that they took part in and their eloquence, gives you a very different conception of the present and also a different sense of possibility about the future.
It can get kind of exciting even. Now, Anthony, I was kind of struck to go back and realize that the book first came out in 1980. Ronald Reagan is president. This was not a radical progressive time. Full backlash was just about to descend on most of our people's movements. Talk to us about how the book got published and why it became such a almost instant success.
Yeah, it is such an interesting story because the book, which has gone on to sell millions of copies, came out first in an edition of 5,000 copies. And the traditional trajectory of most books, with very few exceptions, is that they might have early initial success and then declining sales over time. Whereas Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States is the book that continues to sell and continues just to reach significantly new audiences and new generations of readers. And of course, the official numbers don't even represent it accurately because for every book sold, we know there are many used copies, there are many photocopies, there are many, teachers bringing the book into the classroom, librarians, et cetera. So, it's had so much more of an impact. But when it first came out in 1980, it came out at a time of right-wing backlash, but it connected with all of those people who had participated in the struggles of the 1960s and 1970s and were looking for ways to advance them and looking for ways to continue to move forward struggles for justice. And so really a grassroots kind of underground network of educators, of librarians, of organizers, of activists brought this book to the audiences that then found it and were transformed by it. And it's really a book that over and over and over again, people say changed their lives. It certainly changed mine.
You describe in the introduction to the new 35th annual anniversary edition that those hardback first editions sold out really fast and suddenly it went into paperback and that made it more accessible too. That's part of the picture too, it seems to me.
Absolutely. And the publisher was a corporate publisher, HarperCollins, and that was not their traditional approach. Usually if a book's doing well in hardcover, a publisher will keep it in hardcover for a longer period because it's more expensive. They can make a little bit more money. Howard pushed for a very early release of the paperback, and they were convinced to pursue that approach. And then, yes, very quickly that paperback caught on and has been through countless printings since.
Staceyann, do you remember the first time that you came across a copy of People's History?
I think I came across it in the movie. I think, what's the name of the movie with
Good Will Hunting.
Good Will Hunting. And, it's one of those deep films about white men and their fathers and some kind of sporting event. And so there was a lot of quiet and this book just appeared. And I don't know why I got up, paused the movie, and got up and went to look for it and was just agog that this thing existed and started to read things that other people had posted. I mean, I think I watched the film not when it came out, but long after it came out. And I wasn't even quite an activist yet, but I found it interesting at the time. And then I think my relationship with the book changed when Anthony pulled me in to become a reader. When I was a poet in New York City, a kind of loudmouth, a kind of rabble-rouser, a kind of dissenter myself. And Anthony hauled me in and said, we'd like you to come read this stuff. And I was like, okay, great. You know, I'm down for hanging with a bunch of, you know, famous celebrity types. And I was immediately in rooms with people who felt these things so deeply. And I was at the same time learning all this interesting stuff about America, because within the American framework of media and even history, there was none of this stuff available to me. It was all just new material, interesting material. That was like, I think God, I see myself material.
We have breaking news today, I think, that Staceyann Chin became radicalized by Matt Damon and Good Will Hunting. Breaking news right there. I mean, that's quite a story, Anthony. And you also tell it in your introduction. Matt Damon's mother, I think, had taught the book in history classes, right?
Well, Matt Damon's mother was actually, along with Matt, a neighbor of Howard Zinn in Boston. And she was an educator, is an educator, and knew Howard from organizing and social movements. And so they were family friends and also movement friends. And so actually Howard gave one of those first hardcover editions to a teenage Matt Damon.
A good move on his part. Now, we've talked about some of the roundabout ways that people come across the work of Howard Zinn. I'm wondering how you, as a professional historian, Imani Perry, and professor, how you came across his work and whether you use it in your teaching and your writing today.
So I was a kid in Cambridge, in that sort of same milieu. My mother and I had moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts. So he was around. And I, you know, it was a sense, I think, gosh, I must have been 7 or 8. I remember it being in our house, the book being in our house. And there was a sense in which there was still, even though this was the era of the backlash and, you know, the Reagan era, there was still a sense of movement sort of organizing taking place. And so this was seen as a text, a way of reframing American history. So I don't teach the book, but without question, it is one of those books that actually shaped the way I understood the story of the country. And in some ways, it was a great gift to have that as a contrast to what one might receive in the classroom, especially once I got to high school. I went to a progressive elementary school, but once I got to high school, having a sort of counter narrative of US history is actually, I think, for me, part of how I became an intellectual.
So talk a bit about how different his version of history was. And we should say that he wasn't the first person to do people's history. People's history, if you like, could be seen in the work of W.E.B. Du Bois's Black History of Reconstruction. There's many other examples, and Zinn would be the first to acknowledge them. But for those who maybe aren't as familiar as you are with what history was like, I don't know, when he was born 100 years ago versus how it is today. Could you talk a bit about the distinction between that kind of history and this kind, Imani?
I mean, I think the distinction that's really, there's two pieces that are really important to me. One is that it is so readable. So the idea that writing beautifully actually is important when you tell history, because it actually allows people to get engaged, but also, and I think this probably had something to do with the fact that he came out of movement. It is not just history from the bottom, from the perspective of sort of talking about those who were doing the laboring, but actually focusing on their struggles, on their sort of political, very sort of politicizations and advocacy and organizing, all of those kinds of things from multiple traditions. So you read the book, and even as there's all these devastating events and all of this injustice, you actually can feel hopeful. And that's incredibly important, especially when you're in a backlash moment, right? That you give people something, a sense of possibility and a desire to invest in freedom. And I think that, that's what the book, did and does still. It's part of why it's still so widely embraced.
In that introduction to the People Speak documentary, we hear Howard Zinn talking about, writing the book that didn't exist and that he was asked for by younger people. Anthony, that was part of why he did it, to fill a vacuum. But as Imani's suggesting, he had other agenda too. Can you talk about those? What work he wanted his work to do?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think Imani is absolutely correct to point to giving people a sense of how movements ebb and flow and how people have organized throughout history under circumstances that eventually brought about change through their efforts that they never imagined that they might see in their lifetime, and in many cases didn't see in their lifetime. So giving people that sense of historical perspective, giving that sense of organic movement and how social movements are incredibly powerful in the work through which ordinary people have built those movements. But I also think he wanted to give people a sense of their own agency, their own voice, their own power, their own role in making change. And so he had seen that himself in his own participation in the Southern movement, in the struggle for civil rights, in the struggle against the Vietnam War, in his union organizing. And he had a real infectious way of conveying that a life lived in struggle was the most meaningful life one could live. And so he was very eager to kind of pass on that sense of possibility, that sense of hope, and that sense of community, of doing vital work with other people in struggle.
That's a little bit of what you were just talking about, Staceyann, that sense of being empowered by the stories that Zinn told and that you got to perform, some of those speeches. Can you put your finger on perhaps how any of this experience has changed you and your work?
I think hearing a speech out loud is much better than reading it off a piece of paper, just kind of in your head. But there's something that happens when you actually are embodying, personifying the speech, when you have to live the emotion of the speaker. And then you're just very clearly made to understand how these people were ordinary people who did extraordinary things, who made extraordinary decisions, and they didn't know they were making extraordinary decisions because most of the details of the speeches clue you in on how inadvertent some of these, almost, epic gestures of speeches that changed history, these movements. Almost all the speeches have a quality of somebody just getting up and deciding to do one small thing in the right direction, and this just continuing along that journey and just keeping forward in a way that eventually changes things in this grand way. And being alongside Howard Zinn, just kind of hearing him, he has a very quiet way of speaking, but very powerful, very forward, very direct way of speaking. He didn't stumble very much. It was extraordinary to just be able to live those speeches, to hear Angela Davis's words coming out of my mouth, to hear Marge Piercy's words coming out of my mouth, to hear it changes it for you because you have to live it, you have to embody it, and then you have to not just embody it, but you have to embody it in a way that allows people to hear it in the present.
That embodying is reminiscent to me, Imani, of the embodying that you do on your journey below the Mason-Dixon, that you bring people along on a journey that takes small roads and large, meets known people and less known. The attention to detail in your book all speaks to me, in a sense, in this context, to the influence of Zinn, other influences too. In writing your history, how do you prioritize, how do you perceive your importance, the way that you're doing what you do?
I think, and of course, Zinn was a remarkable role model of humility. And, so that when he and also sort of an attentiveness to the kind of immediacy of human interaction, a disposition towards listening carefully, right? So that, I think it's important to keep in mind he's a person who joined the freedom movement but stayed there for a number of years. He was not someone who just came in the summer. He was on the faculty of Spelman College. He advised members of SNCC. He was, and so he built real relationships, but also there's something about, I think, for scholars and intellectuals to actually value the person-to-person contact transforms the work, right? I think the stakes are higher, the demand of integrity is greater, or demand for integrity is greater. And so I definitely tried to replicate those habits that Zinn modeled so beautifully in the Southern Mystique, but also SNCC, the New Abolitionists.
I should say that there are many books in Howard Zinn's bibliography. We will list some of them before the end here, and The Abolitionist is an important one. Is it right that you once co-keynoted with Howard, Imani?
Yes, I was a young adult, and we did a joint keynote, and I probably wasn't smart enough to be scared in the moment, but it was beautiful. He was so generous and great. I mean, no hubris at all. So, it's a kind of extraordinary organizer, intellectual, incredibly well known. And he, interacted with me just, like a peer. It was really quite, again, another model, of how to be a gracious person.
Now, while we're singing the praises of Zinn, he has certainly had his critics. And coming to you, Anthony, there have been critics from the right and of the left. Donald Trump famously called out Zinn, and there have been many critics, the same folks going after what they perceive as critical race theory, who have added Zinn to their list of problems in education. Zinn's also been criticized sometimes from the left for telling stories perhaps in too simple a way, or not seeing the way that failures or defeats sometimes later play into victories. Are there any of the criticisms that that carry weight with you at this point? And what do you think Zinn would make of this whole debate today about truth-telling and storytelling and history?
Well, first of all, I think I could say with a great deal of confidence that Howard would be proud to be associated with some of the people whose books are currently being attacked, whose ideas are being attacked, whose books are being banned increasingly. He was extremely clear on the importance of anti-racist education. And so he would be absolutely in solidarity with Kimberly Crenshaw, with other people associated with critical race theory, with folks in the 1619 Project and others who are just trying to do basic education about the history of racism, of slavery, of Reconstruction, of Jim Crow, and provide students an opportunity to understand how those impact ongoing institutional and systemic racism today. And so I think he would be very clear on that. About the 1619 Project, I think Howard would have some correctives to perhaps focusing so extensively on the period and the kind of milestone of 1619 as to overlook the milestone with which he opens the people's history of the United States, which is, of course, the conquest of the indigenous population of the Americas. And he always linked those two things. And I think those things need to continue to be linked and understood together, how settler colonialism and slavery are foundational to our history and to the ongoing legacies of so many institutions in this country. But, so Howard welcomed those debates and was very happy to stand up to those who were trying to censor or stifle those kinds of conversations. In terms of the liberal criticisms, I think a lot of them were fairly bad faith. Some of them took the form of kind of guarding the university and the boundary of discipline, and a kind of suspicion of the fact that he wrote popular history, he wrote readable history, he wrote accessible history, and he kind of strayed beyond the professional boundaries of the profession. So that's, one thing that I think Howard was very pleased to do and thought was important to do, and that's part of why he had impact. And then another set of criticisms, I think, have to do with ultimately defending a kind of liberal view of politics where radical change isn't needed, but tinkering is needed. And Howard was always very proudly radical and understood radicalism to mean getting at the root of our problems and the kind of changes that would be truly necessary in order to address them. And I think some of the original critics of the book have come around over time to understand that, in fact, Howard did have a much more sophisticated understanding of the ebb and flow of movements than maybe some of the initial reviews of the book thought it did.
Let's hear from Howard again, and another clip from The People Speak, the 2010 documentary about the work. Here's Howard talking about part of what he imagined the work would do.
When we look back at history, history was not just about war and injustice, but also was the story of people behaving magnificently against great odds. And this was encouraging to me. Because the people up on top, the people who have the power, their power depends on the obedience of people below them. And when people withdraw that obedience, or when, workers go out on strike, or when consumers boycott, or when soldiers refuse, then the makers of war, the profiteers, the purveyors of greed, then they are helpless. You can see the possibility that small acts multiplied by the millions can merge into great movements of social change. Well, that impels us to act.
Coming back to you, Imani Perry, history as a mobilizing tool. Do you have any concerns about that? Do you consider your own book as a mobilizing agent?
I do. I mean, I think, there are billions of facts and details of the past, right? And so history is always political because we are making choices out of those, billions of facts about what is important, right? We're drawing our attention somewhere. And so it's always a value-laden endeavor. And I think, part of the reason I write the way that I do, and I know part of the reason Zinn wrote the way that he did, and so many of us do, is because we are hoping that by being attentive to issues of justice and freedom, that actually will mobilize people, that inspire people, that it'll have an impact on the way people see the world such that they might become invested in liberation struggles. So I have no hesitation about that. I think sometimes people think that objectivity is better than than passion and investment. I think the way that we ward against passion and investment making us sloppy is that we commit to rigor, right? So you commit to actually being a very careful student, not to pretending that you are not invested. So no, I'm not worried about it.
All right, three cheers for passion, investment, and rigor. We certainly believe in it here on this program. Staceyann, we're coming close to the close here, but I can't help but think that Zuri, your beloved daughter, would be somebody of whom Howard Zinn would be very proud and pleased. Do you want to talk a bit about the ideas that perhaps she has about her role in history and how different that might be from what yours were at that time in your life?
There's so many thoughts going through my head, but I wanted to say that if there is any, if I have any criticism of the Howard Zinn phenomenon is one I think he himself would have in how much we listen to white men and their positions and their opinions and how much space they take up and how much success they can be given. We're having this moment with Imani Perry winning the National Book Award, which is amazing because that's a break in a tradition that has been, leaning again away from what it is. And so I think for Zuri, I would like to think that paying attention to the people's history is one way of saying to her, there are so many truths, and that an exhaustive search is what is necessary to find out what really happened. And there are so many ways to celebrate all the achievements that humanity has had in its history. And I think if we are to if we are to say anything about where we are now, that this book is only beginning to uncover what really happened throughout history, and that we have a lot of work to do. And as Imani said, we can't be too committed to rigor, and that we have to leave room for things to happen in different ways, and for us to learn in different ways, and for things to be recorded in different ways. And so I imagine that the way that I record will be different from the way that Zuri will record, and the way that Imani has recorded will be different from the way Howard Zinn recorded. And 20 years, 50 years, 100 years from now, new truths will come forward and be recorded in new ways, and new enlightenments will come to us, and new truths will land on us in different ways.
A little before that, a new book will come to us from you, Anthony Arnove, right? There's another people's book coming out?
Yeah, well, so Howard and I worked together on the book that you mentioned earlier, Voices of a People's History of the United States. It gathers together speeches and letters and manifestos and so many other expressions of people's history in their original form, the primary sources Howard drew on when he wrote A People's History of the United States. And that's the basis of the performances that Staceyann Chin and other musicians and actors and poets have been part of. It's also the basis of the documentary that we've seen clips of today, The People Speak. And Howard and I first released that in 2004. We did an updated edition in 2009. And then after Howard died in 2010, I did a third edition updating in 2014. And then when I started to work on a fourth edition, because there's so many things I wanted to document, including the movement for Black Lives, I realized that really the book was getting quite long, and that in order to include these new voices and to speak to Staceyann's earlier point, the great diversity of voices that have been part of the struggles of the 21st century, it made more sense to do a deeper dive into the period 2000 to the present. So this new edition, which I've co-edited with an organizer named Haley Pesson, includes around 125 speeches and letters and documents and petitions and essays, including from Imani Perry, I'm very proud to say, from 2000 to the present, and we'll be bringing that out in spring of 2023.
Well, this year has seen many celebrations, and there will be more, clearly, in the years and months ahead. Staceyann has been part of several of them, I know, on stage as well as in the doc. Imani, your winning of the National Book Award for Nonfiction feels like a momentous, historic, and super well-deserved moment. Congratulations to you. We should point out that the Zinn Education Project that was founded in 2008 has been out there working with the folks of the African American Policy Forum and others, defending librarians and libraries and schools against censorship, and against the trumped up attacks on what is called critical race theory and actually isn't. At the end of our shows, we often ask people what they think the story will be that the future tells of now. And that seems like something that you kicked off, Staceyann, but I'm going to ask you all anyway. I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years from now, what do you think will be the story the future tells of this moment? And perhaps will Howard Zinn and his type of work have played a part in that? Let's start with you, Staceyann, as you kicked us off already.
I think they will say this was a very dark time when so many of the achievements that we've had in the progress towards more human rights were in danger of being rolled back. But I think 20 years from now, 30 years from now, we will say how crazy it was that they almost won, but that they didn't.
Anthony?
Yeah, I love the way that Staceyann just framed it. I will also say that as part of that story that we tell about this moment, I think there will be a lot of emphasis on the role that working class people played through labor movements, to these new union formations, to these young workers who are organizing in workplaces that seemed unimaginable to organize. And I think Howard Zinn and reading Howard Zinn will very much be part of the education of that new generation of organizers.
And Imani Perry, to you. I don't know whether you're ever asked to talk about anticipatory history writing, but I'm going to ask you.
I'm going to quote someone else, Miriam Kaba, who says that hope is a discipline. And so we are at a crossroads. between, we're on the precipice of absolute destruction, but if I follow the discipline of hope and witness, I wanted to, echo what Anthony said. This is a moment when people are remembering that they are workers across the country and across the globe. And that is incredibly inspiring. And, perhaps suggests that it's a time when we're going to right the ship. We're going to turn this thing around. So I'm going to invest in that as my.
I love it. Hope is a practice. We will exercise and continue that practice here on this program with help from people like you. Thank you all so very much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure talking about and celebrating the work of Howard Zinn.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.